Thank you, Michelle, for starting the recording, and welcome everyone. Really looking forward to the conversation today. We have a lot to get through, so let's go ahead and dive right in. I will start by calling the meeting to order. It is 11:03. Reminder that this is a public meeting. We may have others come in via the Zoom link, and we will be recording this meeting and posting it to the website afterwards. Also, we'll be sending it out to any team members who could not make it today. A quick reminder on our norms. I won't dwell here, but thank you all for committing to these norms. We'll go ahead and start with roll call. So, Emily.
Here.
Jan.
Here.
Madeline.
Here.
Tyler is not here. Larry is not here. Jennifer.
Here.
Althea. I know Althea said she had to step away for a second, but she is here. Um, great. So for the minutes, did anyone have any feedback on the minutes or anything that they wanted to share before we motion to approve? Can I get a motion to approve the minutes from last meeting?
Motion.
Thank you, Jan. Can I get a second?
Second.
Thanks, Emily. Any discussion before we vote? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstained? All right, the motion passes at 11:04. Thank you, everyone. All right, let's dive into the actual content for today. So, for the first 5 minutes, which we are in, we're just getting situated, and then the bulk of our conversation will be about the current state. I will walk through the data that we've been collecting about the state. Then we'll talk about best practices and barriers. Jan, Emily, and Madeline will lead those discussions. And then we will all engage in a discussion about the future vision, which we started last time and will continue today. Our goals for today, one is to make sure that we have clarity about the current state data. We will discuss this more in a second about the sort of format for the June 25th meeting, but we will all be serving as representatives on the data that we're presenting. So want to make sure that everyone has clarity on what the data says. Want to discuss reactions to the story thus far. Does it resonate? Does it feel like what you're seeing? Anything that surprises you? Want to hold space for us to talk about what we're seeing in the data. And then aligning on a bold vision for the state. Miguel has asked that we all start our presentations on the 25th in the discovery meeting with what is our big vision. And so want to make sure as a group we have time to talk about what that should be. And we'll use the parking lot again if there are things that feel out of scope that we want to come back to. So the June 25th meeting, I just wanted to give a little more context on what this is going to look like. So it will start with Miguel giving opening remarks, and then there's going to be a keynote speaker, which is Luke Ryan from Delaware. He was I won't give a super long bio, but he worked under two Delaware governors who both were very invested in career pathways. And Delaware really did a lot to basically reimagine their entire K-12 and post-secondary system around pathways. And then he worked actually under Miguel at the Department of Education at the federal level, and now is at the Rodell Foundation, which is supporting this work as a community partner on the ground. And so we'll be able to ask him questions and, get his learnings from doing this work in the state of Delaware. Then there will be 5 working groups, as you all know. Each working group will be provided 15 minutes to give their presentation. Emily, Jan, and Madeline, as the co-liaisons for our group, will be providing that presentation to the whole commission. And then there will be 15 minutes of discussion following that. We as a group will come up with a question that we want the groups to discuss in the breakout times for 15 minutes. Those groupings will be in constituent breakout groups. So if you remember from the last meeting, you sat in both your working group for a period of time, but also in your constituent group. So businesses sat together, K-12 sat together, higher ed sat together, et cetera. That will happen again this meeting. Those constituent groups is where you will be seated. And because of the interdisciplinary nature of our working groups, there will be one or two of you in each of those constituent groups. And so you'll be sort of serving as the representative of our group in those breakout discussions. And that's why it's important that everyone on the call really understands the data and understands the story and where things are coming out, because you may get questions from other members in your group about specifics on the story that we've presented. So, any questions on what the 25th is going to look like? It's a week from tomorrow, so rapidly approaching. Any questions on that meeting? Okay, so a quick reminder of the North Star question that is grounding our work. What supports does every Connecticut learner need to successfully navigate a high quality career pathway? And what can we do to ensure those supports exist equitably and at scale today? The focus of our conversation today is going to be in this first bucket. Remember that we broke this work into three buckets. So advising, counseling, and navigation is the first one. This is really the bulk of what we're talking about in this working group. Bucket two, the framework for connected learning, is really around sequencing and CTE and what courses should be offered. And then educator and staff supports are what are the supports that are needed for the folks who are supporting students. And so they're a little bit later touch in terms of the amount of research that needs to be done and the sort of amount of solutioneering that we will need to do. But we do want to make sure they're included in our discovery report. So stay tuned. Later in the week, we'll get you more information around those two buckets. But today we're really going to focus on the media section, which is on this first one, this first bucket, advising, counseling, and navigation. And I will turn it over to Emily to talk a little bit about the student journey in terms of counseling.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Riley. One of the things I really appreciated, Riley has assembled an amazing amount of data for us to dig into today. So Riley, huge thanks to you for that, and really looking forward to the conversation rooted there. But this slide that Riley included, I think, is super important and a great place to start in making sure that we are centering the student experience in all of our brainstorming conversations and really putting ourselves in the shoes of a young person as they're going through K-12 and beyond, working towards their post-secondary plans and career aspirations. So one of the things that we know is that post-secondary thinking can't start during senior year of high school. It needs to be part of the surrounding ecosystem of learners much before that. And this slide is helping to paint the picture of one potential learner as they go through their educational career and some of the questions that they might be thinking about as they go through the different stages of their education. So everything from what are my passions? What am I interested in? What's then required to pursue and unlock that pathway? And how do I navigate some of those inevitable setbacks and barriers that a young person might stumble upon as they are working towards that plan? And we know that we can't assume that students are asking and reflecting these questions. We need to be scaffolding that experience. And that really is the focus of our working group. What is the surrounding advising and counseling program that really guides students through thinking about these questions and having experiences and exposures that help them to really unpack the different possibilities after school? So in an upcoming session, we're really going to spend some time dissecting what do students need to understand, know, do, believe as they go through their educational career. Again, that will help ground us in, if that's the end state, what's the wraparound set of experiences that we need to create to result in that. But for a quick pause here for discussion, would love to invite folks to share as you look at the student journey from elementary school through high school and beyond. Where do you feel like we're experiencing the most gaps? And to give you a moment to reflect on that, one of the things that I continue to find is that this continuum of learning is often really smushed during the end of high school. And that then leads to a feeling of overwhelm, so many milestones to get done, really trying to learn and get exposed to all of the things while making some really high stake decisions. So spreading out this learning journey beyond just the tail end of high school is a gap that I continue to observe and experience. Would love to hear other thoughts on gaps that you observe or feel like are out there in the student journey.
I can comment if you'd like, Emily. I think on this slide, the portion I love is the one at the end. And it says throughout the journey, but how do I navigate the barriers and setbacks? And I do like that it's throughout the journey because we have so many students that we know this is the exemplar path, but it's probably very rare that, it's probably only a few students that actually follow this. And so everybody else is going to be asking that question. If I have a setback, if I have a barrier, like how do I still continue on that path? And I think that's really important.
I love that, Jan. So, like, what if you don't get accepted to the college of your dreams? What if the job recommend offer doesn't come through? How do you navigate that with resiliency? Great.
Yeah, maybe I want to take a year off after high school.
Yes.
Like that's kind of taboo right now, but maybe it should be a norm having those conversations.
Thanks, Jan.
I'm happy to comment too. Again, knowing that this is the idea, but I think often what happens, like we know, not every child is actually getting an opportunity to even experience this trajectory. And I know later we're going to be talking a little more in here, but again, like where is this opportunity for our kids to actually be able to do the exploration? Where does that happen within their school experience? I mean, I'm coming in from that lens of K-12, and for many other kids, sadly, that does not happen right now.
I love that. I think that so perfectly points to the opportunity of this working group of these things can't be left to chance. We can scaffold experiences that ensure this happens for every young person. It's great.
Could I
Awesome.
offer one reflection? I'm sorry I'm off camera. My kids today's their first day off from school.
Understood.
And maybe this is also because I have younger children. I think in many cases we lose kids before we even realize, and they are just more compliant when they're little. So we don't really see the evidence that we've lost them until maybe middle school, high school. But I worry we actually have a lot of disengaged younger children who don't like school, don't see why it's meaningful. They don't feel connected to what they're learning. And I don't have an answer for that. And I don't want to be overly negative, but I just want to add it as something we're considering as we think through the entire sort of pipeline of the supports our kids need to feel engaged and imagine what their future could be.
Jen, that relates on so many layers of like, how do we make sure the decision to go to school on a daily basis, turn in the lab report is like rooted in what is the long-term goal and how these things have purposeful connections to that.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I know when I was a teacher, and learning how to write lesson plans, there would be like a check the box, like, and also make sure that you say how this is connected to the real world. And it would be like one sentence where you would state like, and you might do this if you're an engineer. And it just didn't feel rooted in like you're learning this for a purpose and where it's going. So I really love that point. And Althea, I think I might have seen your hand raised.
Yeah, so I would like to piggyback off of what Representative Leeper had said in that same way, but I had put the notes for a later slide. But I agree. I think the touch and engagement has to happen earlier. And I think this makes a lot of assumptions about the environmental conditions in which a child is living in, which may not even allow them the ability, right, to dream, think, or envision a life beyond what they're trying to do each day. In many cases, is survive.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Althea.
Awesome. Well, great conversation already and really appreciate the engagement. And, we're about to jump into some of the current state slides and just want to encourage everyone, jump off mute, get in, ask questions, react. This does not need to be a one-way presentation where I'm just, walking through slide by slide. Like, please feel free to come off mute and let's continue the great, robust conversation. So, current state here, we're really trying to look at from, K-12, post-secondary, adults, the whole spectrum of learning. What does this look like on the ground today as it relates to student supports? So the first thing that we wanted to look at is counselor caseloads. The ASCA recommends a counselor ratio of 250 students for every one counselor. When you look at Connecticut at 322 on average, obviously that is far above that 250 recommendation. And, we are surpassing the national average, which is 385, which is certainly, directionally better. But when you really go under the hood of what is happening in districts, you'll see there are huge inequities. The largest districts, the most urban, the districts serving the large proportion of low-income students are far more likely to have much higher caseloads. And so you have districts where already students may not have the structural advantages that other students have, and then need the most supports as a result, and actually have the fewest supports in terms of one-on-one time with their counselor. And so when you look at an alliance district, which are the districts that have the poorest performance results across the state, you're seeing 12 out of 36 of them have ratios for counselors of 400 to 1. And so you can imagine, with counselors already being burdened with huge amounts of demands on their time, even outside of career and college counseling and navigation services, things like school scheduling and mental health crises, et cetera. The amount of time that they're able to really devote to giving a personalized pathway to each student towards a eventual future is fairly limited when you look at these kinds of numbers. I'll pause here. Any questions about the data here, reactions? Okay. So the next page is really around FAFSA. Want to, before we dig into the data, just level set a little bit, because FAFSA is one measure, but it is certainly not the end all be all of the amount of guidance or engagement that a student is getting. So it is a fairly good proxy for guidance in the sense that it is highly time intensive. And if the student is getting enough guidance that they're able to complete this document, it probably means they're getting high touch guidance. With Workforce Pell coming, every student who is looking to take advantage of Workforce Pell for short-term credential financial aid will need to complete the FAFSA, so it becomes increasingly important. And it does directly lead to increased post-secondary enrollment. When there was the FAFSA challenge through CSDE, we saw huge improvements in FAFSA completion. However, it is not the full picture. There are undocumented students who are unable to apply via FAFSA right now. There are other forms of financial aid through WIOA, other grant programs, et cetera, that this does not capture fully. And there are other non-completion factors. Students may not have a guardian who can support them through completing, these pretty time-intensive materials. And so to look at these completion rates may mask some of the underlying, factors on the ground as we're looking at the data. And so, again, you'll see that lower needs districts have higher completion rates of FAFSA, and higher needs districts have lower completion rates of FAFSA. And again, it just speaks to some of the inequities happening between districts. I'll pause again. Any questions here?
Riley,
right.
just a quick note again to not forget as well as the fear of many students and family to even complete FAFSA because they fear that that data, right, may later on come back to haunt them, particularly for students who may be undocumented.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that. So, college and institutions of higher ed are not the only pathway for students post-graduation, but we want to ensure that students who do choose that as a pathway, especially because it is correlated with higher earnings over a lifetime, have the tools and guidance that they need to persist through the program of their choice. When we look at high school graduates, 48% of them will earn a degree over the course of 6 years. Of students who enroll in college post-graduation, 67% of them will earn a degree in 6 years. In both of these cases, we're seeing people fall out through the funnel, people who intend to complete degrees who are unable to for a variety of factors, which certainly I think student supports and guidance and navigation and counseling is likely one of the factors that is underlying those persistence challenges. Any comments or questions here? I think, Emily, thank you for raising this. I think this was a really important add to our data picture of already you see persistence challenges in post-secondary contexts, but when you then disaggregate by subpopulations, you'll really see even, more drastic, persistence challenges as you look, at smaller slices of the data. So students of color are seeing more challenges in persisting through institutions of higher ed, free and reduced lunch students, as well as English language learners. You're seeing, if you just look at the 6-year graduation rate for English language learners, you're seeing a 14% completion rate. And so what do we need to do for our students to make sure that every student, regardless of background, demographics, zip code, is able to persist through the program of their choice? Because right now things, again, I think this is a recurring theme, is already you're having challenges at a statewide level, but then when you go down a level deeper, you're seeing challenges for individual populations that, really need, already are facing equity challenges and need, additional supports. Comments or questions here?
Riley, I feel like the leaky pipeline that you've been outlining on the past couple of slides, again, like really speak to the charge of this working group of what then are the gaps in our earlier advising and counseling structures. Is it a lack of understanding of how to reapply for financial aid in subsequent years? Is it the support infrastructure and network that I had in high school changed or went away after graduation? How do I navigate that? Or did I not necessarily pick and make an informed decision about my pathway and I start college and say, this is not for me, this is not what I wanted? All of those things could be solved for in different ways by making the advising and counseling experience better to avoid this leaky pipeline, which has all sorts of costs of you don't get the degree and the debt and burden of making that change.
Absolutely. And one thing I've been thinking about to that point is not for the 25th, but after the 25th, as we're thinking about solutions, how do we engage students directly about their experience and make sure that it is informing the solutions that we're recommending? And so whether that be focus groups or some sort of survey to students, really understand the barriers that they're facing and where the reasons behind they might be why they might be falling off of this pipeline, to make sure that we're not making assumptions of what counseling needs to look like that don't actually address their needs.
Riley, can I ask a question? How are we defining student of color?
Student of color in the, I can go back to double check, but in the National Student Clearinghouse, I believe it is students who identify as anything other than white. That is, I need to double check that stat, but I believe that's how the National Student Clearinghouse defines it. Or are you interested in potentially seeing the data disaggregated in a different way?
Yeah, I did make a note of that again for other slides, but yeah, I just wanted to get some clarification on that because that's very interesting that it's every non-white student is how we're defining student of color. That'd be helpful, at least for me. I'm not sure how others feel.
Absolutely. And That's a great flag, and I need to go back to the database because I was using their tagged populations. And so please do, if you have thoughts about how the data is broken up, would love to hear them. And I can go back and see like what is the possible ways to disaggregate. Okay, I think the next part of the story is getting a little bit clearer on what is actually happening once students are enrolled in post-secondary institutions. And so 70% of students at CSCU are enrolled in general studies. So not in a degree program that is aligned with a clear pathway or a career path, but more of just sort of general educational programming. And that is, showing up in the data in terms of wages after they complete a degree program. So students who are studying general studies on average have a salary of $31,500 on an annual basis, as opposed to the healthcare and manufacturing salary bands that you can see here. Also, if you are thinking about what is happening at institutions of post-secondary learning for Pell students specifically. So, you're thinking about students who are lower income. At CSCU specifically, we're seeing persistence challenges. Only 47% of Pell recipients are completing their degrees at CSCU, as opposed to 60 and 70% at privates and UConn, respectively. And so we're seeing that at our public institutions in the state, outside of UConn, their need for greater supports broadly, but especially for students who are receiving Pell. And, this speaks to a real guidance gap. I don't think that, most counselors or guidance, professionals would suggest that an individual enroll in a higher education institution and study general studies. That's not to say we don't want students to explore, but we don't want them to explore at the expense of having huge amounts of debt, especially if they're not going to complete their degree. And so how are we ensuring that students in institutions of higher ed are getting the guidance that they need that is labor market informed to pick pathways that have real living wage, financially stable jobs at the end of them? I'll again pause. Any thoughts or feedback here? All right, I will try to speed through because I know that we're running out of time and I want to make sure that we have time for robust conversation. I think this last slide here is really about the folks who are not being served currently in the state of Connecticut. So you have 106,000 students from ages 14 to 26 who are disconnected, not in school, not employed. And this number has been trending downwards. So a couple years ago, this was closer to 120,000. So we're seeing improvements, but still, this is a population that currently, has fallen out of the system. And there's a real equity gap in terms of the students who are more likely to become disempowered and disconnected. And so early intervention really matters. The less time that a student is disconnected at school, the more likely they are to be able to persist through high school and through college. And so, identifying students early who are at risk of being disconnected via attendance, via grades, via Emily, you had a great phrase, what the ABCs. A was attendance. What was B? Behavioral?
Behavior, credits, course performance.
Yeah. So identifying early to try to, reduce these sorts of outcomes is really important. I'll again pause and then turn it over if there are no further questions here on the story. One broad question for the group before we transition is just, is there anything that surprised you here? Is there anything that did not sort of match what you thought was happening in the state or your expectations or your lived experience? Curious to get reactions.
I just ask, following up on a question that, or a comment that was made, excuse me, it says 57,000 students, youth ages 14 to 26. Do we have data on the younger ages before the age of 14 as well?
Hmm, that's a great question. Not through this measure. Um, I think that's an important question for us to answer to the comments that happened earlier around we might be losing students earlier than 14. We'd have to think about how we could measure that. It could be via a survey of some sort where we're sort of like talking to counselors in elementary schools and middle schools and anecdotally collecting evidence. I'm not sure what sort of hard evidence exists outside of that. Emily, you might have perspective on this from your work.
I am not sure if the exact data point that Jan is indicating exists, but I think for these reports, there were definitions of if a student is chronically absent, they have X number of suspensions, then they're classified in this way. So I would think that you could apply that same methodology to earlier years.
Definitely can look into that, Jan.
Can I also ask Riley and Emily as well, the factors that are contributing to the disconnection? Are we looking at that? Because when I think about just coming from a more recent kind of convening of folks, when we think about the housing crisis,
Mm.
I know Waterbury at one point, the number of evictions and displacements, like how that's contributing to one, not only attendance, but also to the disconnection. And then when we have those kind of realities happening, older students having to kind of take care of the younger or
Mhm.
supporting them in those ways, how is all of that contributing to the disconnection, specifically housing, because we are in a crisis here in the state as it relates to that. So just wondering what some of the factors are that you found.
Althea, I feel like that has to be a part of our recommendation moving forward. If our recommendation for a gold standard counseling program is help students with applications with FAFSA, and we don't say, wait, what about basic needs, food security, housing? We're missing a key part of the equation that is the foundation.
Couldn't agree more. And I was reading this really interesting article about this school in Oklahoma that overtook a mall. And the idea is like, could you have all of the services that kids need in one site? So it would have healthcare, it would have food, it would have, mental health support. And so what kind of innovative models are we bringing to the table that potentially stretch our thinking of like what school actually means? Because I do think, to your point, Althea, like this is not about teachers not doing enough. This is like a systemic problem that needs to be solved for. And so I can definitely share that article, but I would love to hear from you all, even in like follow-up emails to this. What are some of the factors that you think are the second order factors that are causing some of this disconnection that we should be, digging in a level deeper, whether that's being housed, being undocumented, food insecurity, et cetera. Those are things that I want to make sure that we're, going that extra step on and getting the fuller picture. Yeah, Jennifer.
I think one of the things we should also include in the conversation about what's driving disconnection is technology. I think it plays a bigger role than we realize. And now our poor teachers are competing, right, with TikTok and Snapchat to engage kids. And obviously, it's really challenging. Uh, among many other challenging pieces of technology. I think also the way we forced technology into the classroom during COVID was everyone was doing their best with limited information to meet needs really rapidly. And I think we need to do like a reevaluation if that's actually serving kids, because I think we do have a fair bit of data that would suggest it's not. But we don't know how to sort of like back out of where we are. And I think it's related to the disconnection.
So true and important and double stamp. I just went to a talk about workforce development and youth mental health and the connection between the two and the way that, workforce training gives students a real sense of purpose and can really be a big lever in mental health. But one of the big topics of conversation was around AI and like both recognizing the reality that students will need to know how to use AI to access any career in the future, most likely, but also that it has a real toll on students' mental health and how do you balance the two of those things. So yeah, a very timely comment.
And if I, before we switch sides, I think to all these things, I agree. And I think we have to, we're talking about our, our K-12 students, but I think we're seeing the same thing at the post-secondary level, right? The basic needs issues have become a barrier also to completion there. Just in very recently talking to Dr. Wang at Gateway, it is one of the biggest barriers to completion and persistence. So I think we, just kind of broaden that scope when we begin to think about what those supports might look like, not only for our K-12 students, but more like K-16 or, yeah.
Absolutely. This is so helpful. Thank you all. These are the exact kind of comments we were hoping to surface. So really appreciate your engagement here. We obviously cannot present all of this data in 15 minutes on the 25th. So one of the things that we'll need to think about as a group is how to narrow down this story to the most compelling set of facts on the ground, the most important barriers that we want to highlight. And so over the next week or so, we'll be refining that story and would love your input on what are the things that are resonating most for you all. We are going to move into best practices and barriers. So just to give a little bit of context before we dive in, the co-liaisons and I and social impact partners broadly have read through probably 100 different reports in terms of best practices on, the whole range of topics. Emily has gone back to Purposeful Pathways a couple of times, and I highly recommend that you all read that one if you haven't already. It is a really great report. But what we're about to show is really sort of a synthesis across many different studies across, probably about a 20-year time horizon in terms of what are best practices and what are the barriers that students face. What we don't have represented here yet that will be coming soon is what does this actually look like on the ground in Connecticut, as well as in other states that we might want to compare to as a model for best practices? So these are best practices in an ideal hypothetical world in terms of what the literature says, but want to make sure that we're rooting it in true examples of what's happening on the ground and how states and districts have systematized this. So that to come next. And I will turn it over to Madeline.
Thank you, Riley. And I think we all would agree, right, that in order to do this work, it cannot rely on only one individual person doing the work that it takes to ensure that the advising, the counseling, and the navigation is happening. And often what happens is that the reality is that it's all on the shoulders of our school counselors. But we have to think about broader, right? That we need this network to support the work. And ideally, there would be dedicated counselings that are supporting to do that navigation. You heard earlier, Riley share the data around caseloads for counselors. But not only that we need our students, right, to reap the benefits of having those peer mentors, particularly when it comes to first generation students. So like informally, like hearing about what are possibilities, how to navigate the system, how do we bring the knowledge to our families? Like I recall my own experience as a first generation college students and parents that didn't even make it to high school. They had no clue. And I had the unfortunate experience that my counselor didn't even see me. Nobody saw me. And I happened to be one of the lucky ones, right? But our kids do not have, they can be lucky. We have to create those conditions. So how do we expand all of this knowledge to support our families and also being able to understand everything about career exploration and meeting them where they're at? And the importance of our community-based organizations in supporting the work so that it becomes a bridge between, education, workforce development, human services, becoming key to this work. Um, and employers, like right now in New Haven, like we're putting such a huge emphasis on our career pathways, and none of it would be possible without our employers being part of these advisory groups that we have that are informing us about what are the needs, what are the skills that our kids are going to need for the jobs that are most needed in the surrounding area, and truly advising the curriculum that we are developing to ensure that those pathways have the courses that are going to meet the needs so that they can get those stackable credentials. But again, at the end of the day, we know, I want to go back to the beginning, that so much of it tends to be on the shoulders of our school counselors. And we know that right now, even though we want our counselors to follow the framework, right? Even our own Connecticut framework around developmental counseling, the reality on the ground is that most of their time is going towards dealing with addressing the mental health needs of students. And we need to ensure that there are distinct roles, right? That we are tending to the mental health needs of students, but that we also need dedicated services around the career navigation piece. If I share a little more, like my reality on the ground, because I do want to hear what exactly has been your lived experience as it relates to the work of our school counselors. Like right now, I have itinerant counselors in 14 of my K schools, right? So although we understand the importance of career awareness happening earlier, if I have itinerants, when those counselors are there, the reality is they're going to go where the urgency is. And the urgency tends to be around those mental health needs, scheduling, right? All of that good work. And very little it's being dedicated to the career advising. The other piece too is that even at the high school level, again, just speaking with my own experience, right now I am fortunate that I've been able to dedicate 3 dual credit specialists, right, that I'm able to funnel to support all of my high schools. But again, I'm talking about 3 people supporting that work across 10 different high schools. So we have to get creative. Like, how do we identify like teacher leads within each of my pathways to do a lot of that work around the advising? In a nutshell, it comes down again to resources. I do feel like we have a good vision of what it takes to be able to break down the barriers and bring about access to our kids. But at least my lived experience centers around, again, the resources. But I want to pose it out to the entire team. What is your lived experience? What are you seeing around you? Does this match what you think is happening across our Connecticut schools? I want to pause there just to hear from you.
I'll just quickly start by saying that I recently went to a focus group of school counselors. Actually, a counselor from New Haven was there, and I will say she had, of the school counselors, the most sort of like career mindset and the most supports in place to help with applications, to help with career navigation. But the school counselors who we talked to in lots of areas of the state said that this is the first conversation that they had had about counseling related to careers specifically in 10 years. That there just wasn't availability of training around how do you even counsel folks related to in-demand careers? How do you counsel in the age of AI? That there are 2 trainings offered a year and they are booked almost immediately, and it's standing room only and you can't get in. And so that was just super enlightening for me as someone who's not in a school anymore, of like the reality of what school counselors are facing on the ground in terms of their desire for this knowledge, but their inability to learn and to access the training that they need.
So if I can piggyback off of that, Riley, I wonder, as a part of this work, as we think about it in the overall picture, how to, like, what we're developing actually impact the training, the education and learning of future counselors before they get in our schools, right? So they come with a mindset and approach with that when they're engaging students, right? Not being reactive, right? Based on need, dollars, availability, but really responsive in a way that that's just assumed, right? It is, right? It begin to shift the culture and way in which we deliver, right? Career counseling and advising to students. So I don't know, and I'm not trying to add a ton of questions, but I have questions, right? And I know we're at the beginning of this, but I think, how do we think about that? Just hearing some of the quotes that were in the future slides from them about, so this is training and education and learning that they didn't receive, right? It didn't even, so, there's a lot of things we have to shift in the academy, right? But I think when we think about that preparedness, how do we impact that as a part of the work of this commission?
I think, Althea, I appreciate that so much, right? Because often we're expecting people to do something that they haven't even been trained, right? We haven't built their capacity. So how do we do that? And where does that happen, right? To ensure that we are breaking down the gaps that we know already exist.
Yep. And the other point I had, so when I think about community-based organizations being here and seeing them as an extension of the school-based advising, the reality is community-based organizations are more cost-effective because we know, the cost of what, employing someone in a school district is like a person and a half, right? And nonprofits and community-based organizations don't have that same type of administrative overhead and costs that they have to carry. Additionally, community-based organizations are a bit more nimble, right? In ways that our districts are not. I know for us in Waterbury, an example would be particular school where there are a lot of challenges with students around suspensions, fights, students having some, mental health challenges where we're a community school district. And this is one of our community schools where we were able to embed a community-based partner within the school, framed it in a way that was very kid-friendly, teacher supported, and done collaboratively with the principal as well. So where students literally, there was a process and a naming of how they can engage supports in a office space that was made available for this community-based partner, that students knew they could ask a teacher, it was a certain name for the pass, and then they can go see Miss Cheryl, right, in her space, located in proximity to the school social worker and others in the building. And so, but that cost compared to what you have to pay for a counselor or social worker, we probably can deliver similar services, community-based organizations that is, and probably, even more than that. So just thinking about ways beyond just the extension, but the collaboration, incorporation, and integration of community-based partners in our schools in a way that's user-friendly. Like there's, I think we have to begin to reimagine what partnerships look like. They're not external to the school, right? But find ways to integrate them within the school.
And Althea, I know we're short on time, but I do want to share this experience. I just came from a meeting in one of my schools, to your point, where we just started a pilot with our piece of the pie. And the fact that basically 3 people that are doing the work of supporting our students from what are your interests, where do you want to be connected? They now got connected with jobs and navigating it, even the piece around, well, what do you need to make sure that you get the job, go to the interview? What are the barriers, right? Well, I don't have an ID. I don't have basic means, right? 3 people that are able to do that individualized support for children to be now successful at a job that has allowed them to get re-engaged with school. Again, so we just have to be a little more creative on how we create these expanded networks, right, that are going to be supporting our students.
And I think that leads beautifully into our next section around what are the actual practices. So Madeline walked us through who are the people that we need in place, but there's also a set of practices that need to be true, and deeply coordinated practice, embedded, integrated is part of that. And so I'll turn it over to Emily.
Awesome, great. So to preview the next discussion that we're hoping to have, really we want you to reflect on and share where do you see some of these practices or other practices in place. So be thinking about that. This is another one of those like lean in slides for this small font. Really, there were 5 categories of practices that are being highlighted here. The first on the left-hand side, how are we leaning into and creating opportunities for deeper coordination across systems? So think K-12, post-secondary workforce, across regions too, so that every district is not reinventing the wheel. In the middle column, there's a number of practices that are all pointed towards how do we expand access and address opportunity gaps that we know are so persistent in Connecticut. And then on the right-hand side, you're seeing practices attached to personalization. How do we make sure every young person graduates with a meaningful and personalized plan? We've already talked about this work cannot start at the end of a high school journey. It needs to be early and often. And then the final bucket in the lower right-hand side, all of this work needs to be deeply rooted in the jobs that exist today and will exist in the future. So you see a number of practices here. I'll share a couple of things that I've observed, and I would love to open it up to other things that you all are seeing that are feeling promising. Maybe connecting the data-driven and personalization. One of my colleagues shared this report, a RAND survey across the country that had 70% of educators saying they lack access to post-secondary data. 70%. Only 1 in 3 say they do have that information. So at RISE, we've really invested in how can we provide surveys for high school students, and then we provide a data hub that offers visibility for every single student. What is their post-secondary plan? And we can see when that plan changes, and then have they completed the milestones? Did they meet with the enlistment officer if they want to go into the military? Have they completed financial aid applications if they're planning for higher education? So that has been really important and transformational. And then the other one that I would share that aligns to the coordination bit on the left, Riley spoke about the FAFSA challenge on an earlier slide. There too, it doesn't feel like rocket science, but the fact that 5 years ago, we said like we need to be bringing schools and districts together to share with one another what are all of the barriers and obstacles and what are the breakthroughs in places that you're seeing successes. And there were dozens of high schools across dozens of districts who came together in this community, meeting every month to share that learning with one another. And FAFSA rates improved. So in a small state that can sometimes feel really hyper-localized, how are we creating opportunities for educators to learn with and from one another? Unfortunately, funding ran out when COVID funding ran out. So that too, I think, points to a challenge of when we have a best practice, how do we sustain those evidence-based practices? All right, let's open it back up. What practices, either ones that you've seen here that you've seen play out in great ways, or other practices that you want to bring to the floor?
In the interest of time, I'm going to suggest that folks send these via email to make sure that we get to barriers. Thank you, Emily, for sharing your perspectives. I think those are super valuable given your purview across many different school districts. I'm going to turn it over to Jan. If Jan, you can spend about 4 minutes talking about barriers and asking questions, then I will spend 1 minute at the end just very quickly talking about next steps, and we will take our visioning conversation offline. And also, I'll share this at the end, but I am planning on connecting with folks one-on-one to get some individual feedback so we can get deeper into vision statements then as well.
Sounds good. Yeah, so I think this is a conversation that does have to be expanded, because just thinking about the barriers that have to be overcome, it can be overwhelming. So we've tried to put them into 4 different buckets. So the first one we have is structural. These are siloed systems, inadequate counselor ratios, which we've been talking about, the mental health burdens that we all know that we have got to come up with a way to help students if we're going to make this successful. There's also been a lot of talk about equity, social capital inequities, transportation barriers. Again, the caseloads in our high poverty districts. We have got to work on equity in Connecticut. Cultural, college first culture, insufficient counselors. Again, this theme keeps coming up. And then the capacity, funding, the unsustainability that we have right now, and no cross-district coordination. And just, I think the one that resonates right now with me is the capacity, especially the funding on sustainability. Representative Leeper can attest to this. A lot of the conversation this past session is on how are we going to fund our schools adequately. We had a 1-year Band-Aid, but there is a Blue Ribbon Commission that's going on at the same time as this commission is, to talk about how are we going to fund our schools so that they have the resources that they need to be successful. And that's only a small portion of it, because if we're going to change the way that we look at the outcomes for students, we're going to have to fund that. So it's going to be an additional amount. So that's the one I think that really resonates right now with me. But I would love to hear your thoughts. And again, Riley, I turn it over to you if you'd rather have it through email, because I know we only have 2 minutes left, then we can do that as well.
Yeah, maybe that makes most sense. I will share, I was at a Chamber of Commerce convening yesterday. Garrett Sheehan was there from New Haven. There are folks from Central Connecticut, Hartford, as well as Waterbury. So a lot of different districts represented. And someone, to your point, Jan, was sharing about, we just had this program that we finally felt like we were finding our stride through the Good Jobs Challenge and through ARPA funding, and now that's gone away. And what do we do now? And so how do we create more sustainable levers? So I very much agree, Jan, with your sentiment there. There is obviously so much to talk about here. And so want to make sure that this conversation keeps going about I highly recommend that everyone sort of looks through these vision statements, not because they are what we need to attach to, but because they are good jumping off points for thinking about the vision statement we want to put forward. And so my recommendations are these. I will schedule an individual meeting with each of you over the coming week. I know it is hard to coordinate calendars for us all to be in the same place at the same time, but I really want to hear feedback from each of you. What resonates, what doesn't, where do you have questions, what do you think the vision should be, et cetera. So look out for an email from me to coordinate calendars. And then, as we said, this was only the first of 3 buckets. And so want to make sure that we're discussing all of the data. Please look out for an email at the end of the week. We would love for you to review those materials in depth and also provide feedback of what do you think is the most impactful part of the story? Because we are going to need to narrow down this broader set of data into a set of really compelling slides. I would say we're trying to aim somewhere in the range of 8 to 10 slides that really tell the story in a punchy way. And then we will actually, after the fact, be sending out our, what we're calling like a post read or a leave behind that will have this more rich data. So it's not that it's not going somewhere, but it just won't be used for the purposes of the presentation. We will not meet on Wednesday, 6/24 as a full working group because we have the commission meeting the next day. So I will cancel that meeting time. Co-liaisons, we know that we're meeting then to discuss some of the presentation logistics. The week after that is the week of the 4th. So we will not be meeting on that 1st of July either. So just wanted to give you guys a heads up going into looking at the next 2 weeks. So all that to be said, in sum, look out for an email from me with time to coordinate individual meetings. Take a look at the materials at the end of the week. Feel free to send me an email or a text or call. Happy to use whatever channel. Please CC Emily, Madeline, and Jan as we're all coordinating on this. And thank you all so much for being here. And with that, I will adjourn the meeting. I'll hang on the line for